The biggest key component is psychological safety. And so psychological safety is whereby we feel that the person is consistent, they're reliable, they do what they say, therefore they're trustworthy. And within that, we end up feeling really secure. And so this is something so super important for us to recognize, because what it will do is that it will teach us that we are accepted and we are acceptable just the way that we are, that we don't have to behave in a particular way in order for the person to still do what they say that they're going to do, or for the person to be consistent, for the person to be reliable, for us to be able to trust them. We don't have to curate, or we don't have to work really hard on this third imagined object over here in order to be safe, right? So that really takes us out of the fight or flight system, the fight or flight zone. And this again is so important, because if we don't have safety, we're not actually being ourselves. We hold on to this mask. We create a different version of ourselves to try and have a relationship with that person, but that person ends up having a relationship with the mask and not us. Whereas actually, if the person is psychologically safe, so they're reliable, they're consistent, they're trustworthy, we can take the mask off, and we're having a relationship with the person as we truly are. So it's really removing any conditions of love or care. And this is really where we experience freedom within that love, because we then become free to self-express, to be who it is that we really want to be. Within that, we have acceptance. So acceptance of our values, of our characteristics, even if they're not aligned. So what I mean by that is, I might love skydiving, I might love dangerous sports, but my partner might not. My partner might really hate that stuff and would never want to do those things with me. But there's acceptance of the differences. And so that in itself becomes really, really healthy, because then I feel accepted as I am, and I don't have to shift, or I don't have to sacrifice, I don't have to break down parts of myself in order to fit in with my partner's image. And so that's one key component, is that you're not feeling as though you're having to change or to curate a version of you to fit in your partner's life, and vice versa, that you're not changing them so that they fit into parts of your life, because actually then you're not in love with that person, you're in love with something else, and you're just trying to make that person fit that box. And within this, there's also the importance of having open conversations. And so I'm a strong believer that it's not actually about communication, but it's about understanding. So the reason why any of us have a conversation with each other or communicate is not necessarily just because, it's actually with the purpose of understanding. And so it's really about how you resolve arguments, but also how it is that you always understand each other and grow together. So one thing that I tell my clients all the time is, do you communicate with the intention of responding to what your partner said, or do you communicate with the intention of understanding your partner? And I promise you that this is such a game changer. If you communicate with the intention of understanding your partner, and you do that every single time, and both people do this, by the way, if you do that every single time, that will absolutely change the dynamic of your relationship, because that will help you resolve arguments. That will help you to get to a space of acceptance. You're no longer having to constantly go into defense mode. You're not feeling like you're being attacked, but actually you end up being psychologically, emotionally, mentally connected. Yeah, so I would say effective communication is truly about understanding that other person. And that's where the key is. And something to keep in mind is that we might not always understand our partner, and that's okay. Be open to that and recognize that you might not always understand your partner. And actually, I would argue is that you will never truly understand your partner. And the reason for that is because you have not walked their exact life. You are not exactly them, but the idea is that you're always trying to understand them, and they always feel like you're trying to understand them. And this is key, because what this does is that your partner feels seen, your partner feels heard, they feel understood, they feel appreciated, and they feel valued just as they are. Even if you're not fully understanding each other, but by the very process of trying to understand each other, and you do that through communication, that actually makes the person feel held, and they're held in mind, they're held in heart. And why this is so important in terms of fostering self-worth is because actually you're in a relationship where you are totally in the same mental and emotional space as each other. Even if there's this discord, even if there was a disconnect, even if there was something that was kind of jarring, it doesn't really matter, because actually you guys will end up being back in that same emotional space. And that feels really safe. And what happens in that moment is you feel safe, but also you feel valued enough for somebody to really hold you in mind, for somebody to truly care about you and to accept you fully as you are. Even though they might not know the full you, and that's okay, but actually there's always this intention of holding you and really considering you. And that happens within communication. And that in itself is a great start in terms of really supporting your worth and recognizing that you're valuable, that you are valid in any case. Mutual respect is absolutely mandatory, and have spoken so much with my clients about this. And the thing is that if there's no basic respect for one another, you can kind of forget about the whole thing. And I know that that might seem really brash, but it's true, because mutual respect is really about saying, I respect you as a living, breathing being, almost like I respect anybody else walking down the street, right? And so we absolutely need to get basic respect there. And the reason why it's so important is because if we respect that person, we also respect them for having different viewpoints, for having different emotions, for having different thought processes, for having different experiences and different perceptions. And this is key, because what will happen is inevitably in any relationship, there will be an argument, there will be a disagreement, there will be something that comes up, and it will be difficult to manage. And so the way that we manage that is, if we have basic respect, we will also respect that person enough to recognize that their viewpoint is valid, that their perception is valid. Even if I disagree with it, like I might have my own viewpoint, but I respect them enough to accept that this is their reality and this is what they're going through. And would have to also accept their reality of, if I hurt them and they're feeling hurt, even if I didn't intentionally hurt them, that doesn't matter, but the impact is that they ended up being hurt, right? And so I have to accept that reality, and that's really through respect. And this is a bi-directional process, and it's only through that method that we can then really start to open ourselves up to having those difficult conversations and to be able to resolving some of those difficult conversations. So what it would look like is that instead of me entering defense mode, and let's say I unintentionally hurt my partner, or my partner says to me, you know what, when you did this, it really upset me. And I'm sat here thinking, I didn't mean to upset you. So, you're like, no, your viewpoint is valid. If I went there, then I'm entering defense. What I'm doing there is I'm criticizing my partner, but I'm also shutting them down, because all I've got in mind is my viewpoint, right? Is what my intention was. But actually, if I respect my partner enough, then I can suspend my urge to respond in a defensive way, even though that might be true for me, and I can share that afterwards. So I can share things that I have conflicting viewpoints on or disagreements on. I can absolutely share that, but I postpone that so I can really hear and understand my partner. And again, it goes back to the intention of understanding, but I can only do that if I've got basic respect. And so then I can really consider, wow, you know what, if this is what you were seeing, and this is what I did, and you saw that, that is truly horrific, and I'm so sorry, I never meant to hurt you. And that's when we can really start to accept the other person's position. And so I can step into that other person's realm, into my partner's viewpoint of what's happened, but also I can then invite them over to my viewpoint and say, you know what, I really didn't mean to hurt you. This is what I was thinking about, and this was what was going on for me. Like, would you mind checking out my viewpoint? And that becomes a much easier conversation. So instead of us getting really stuck, it's through respect and through the attempt of always understanding each other. That's when we can really shift forward in conversations, but also in terms of the development of the relationship. Boundaries are absolutely essential. The thing that I would say about boundaries, and this is something that I think is a missed point a lot in society and social media, that a lot of people talk about being very hard on your boundaries, knowing your boundaries and sticking to them. That's not quite the way to go. I do absolutely believe in boundaries. I think boundaries are important, but it actually comes from working on your self-worth. Boundaries are always a consequence of knowing your worth, in that your worth is infinite. That's where the boundaries lie. And often what happens is that if people focus in really hard on working on their boundaries and strengthening their boundaries, but actually they feel broken in terms of their sense of worth, they'll actually start feeling really guilty if they have a boundary. So they might say no to somebody, but then a few minutes later they'll say, oh, you know what, I feel like I was being really harsh there, or they're going to think really badly of me, or they're going to hate me, they're going to this, and this. And they start to feel really guilty, and they talk themselves out of the boundary. And so they bend over backwards anyway. And the reason why they do that is because of their fragile sense of self-worth. And so it's not actually about focusing in on what the boundary is or isn't, but it's actually focusing in on your worth and really strengthening your sense of self. Because the stronger that you are in that, the more grounded you are in that, the easier it is to say no to somebody, the easier it is to have a boundary and to stick to it. Because actually, it's not laced with guilt, it's not laced with shame, it's not laced with anxiety. It just is what it is. And so it becomes a lot easier for you to recognize, actually, this is what I'm willing to accept, and this is not what I'm willing to accept. And so you'll have a lot clearer remits in terms of what is a non-negotiable and what's a negotiable. So if I was just to briefly explain that, so a non-negotiable and boundary are things which I will absolutely not accept, or things that I absolutely need. Right, so they are absolutes, and they tend to be polar opposites. So, for example, I will absolutely not accept betrayal or disrespect, but I absolutely need respect, honesty. And then there's stuff in the middle that might be negotiable. So the negotiable might be things like continuous communication. And so obviously communication is really important, but the way it goes might be context dependent. So for example, if you've got a friend or a family member or something, and usually communication's okay, but then all of a sudden they just go a bit cold and you're not sure why. And they send you a message saying, you know what, I'm just so busy with work, or I'm really stressed out with my own stuff. I'm going silent for a bit. I'm really sorry. If they communicated something, then you'd be able to take some context into consideration. Or, for example, if you had a partner and you were living together and you shared the household chores, but then all of a sudden they stopped doing things and they were ill, or they were off work, or they were struggling with their own mental health, their own physical health, whatever it might be, then that's something that's negotiable. Then there's context to keep in mind. And so actually you're able to then have a bit more scope to consider that other person's viewpoint. And so it's not a hard, rigid boundary. It's something that you would want to share, but there has to also be a green zone in the middle where you can negotiate. Empathy has multiple levels, and on the most basic level, empathy is to say, I cognitively understand what you're going through, full stop. However, empathy that involves compassion is much more powerful. So that is to say, I understand what you're going through, cognitively as well as emotionally, I can feel what it is that you're feeling, and I have so much kindness towards your suffering. That is the ideal place to be in. The level beyond that, in terms of empathy, would be to say, I understand what you're going through, and I want to rescue you. I want to save you. That actually starts to become dangerous territory, and that's actually an unhealthy level of empathy, because what it does is that it creates a codependency, and it creates a codependency in a relationship whereby you operate to continuously rescue your partner who might be struggling, and sure, you want to help them, but there's a difference between caring and being a rescuer. So being a rescuer is to say, you know what, leave it, I will take care of everything. And you do that repeatedly, but then what happens is that they become dependent on you, and you actually inadvertently disable them. Versus caring, where you say, I understand what you're going through, that's really painful, what can we do to make this better? And so you're really recruiting them in terms of them also helping themselves, that you're willing to offer your hand, but you're also wanting them to offer their hand as well. And so you can negotiate to the degree of who does what, but actually there's more collaboration there, there's more reciprocation, and also you're not entering rescuers mode, because if you're entering rescuers mode, you're also implicitly implying that they're a victim, and that becomes really toxic, especially if it ends up being a chronic issue. But actually, if you're caring for them and they're or caring about them, so you're caring and not being a caregiver, then you're also asking them to care for themselves, and you're asking them to collaborate and to join with you in that process. And that becomes a much more empowering state to be in. It might feel harder, especially if you're tolerating not entering rescuer mode, that might feel harder, but actually it's much more empowering for both of you in the long run. And you can both understand where it is that you stand with each other. And so in terms of how does this really cultivate a healthy relationship? Well, if there is cognitive and mental empathy, you can both really connect with one another. So you both really feel held in mind by the other person. And it's a lot easier to then start picking up on little cues that the other person is presenting, or bids that other person is presenting, and to really go with it in order to nurture the relationship. So, for example, it might be your partner comes home from work, they sit down and they say, oh, and then you can ask them, well, what's going on? Seems like you're tired, or what was your day like at work? And you know, you might not know exactly what to say, but you say something, you pick up on their side. And in that moment, they feel seen, they feel held in mind. And so they can then respond, even if they respond with something like, oh, work was busy, don't worry about it. And you can say something to them like, well, it sounds like you're really tired. I mean, do you want to vent for a little while? Do you want a cup of tea? Like, how can we work through this? And whatever it might be that you guys agree on, actually, there's really the sense of being held in mind and being emotionally connected. And it's actually having those that is crucial to maintaining a relationship. And you know, we've got data here that suggests that actually people who don't do this on a regular basis, there's about an 80 to 86% chance that they would separate after a year. So it's really, really powerful to be able to both emotionally and cognitively empathize with your partner. Every conflict is not about that person themselves. So if you're both really wanting to make this relationship work, I would suggest that you take the approach of the problem is the problem. The problem isn't me, the problem isn't you, but the problem is the problem. And we have to be on the same team looking at this problem. And it's only when you're on the same team and you share the same ideals in terms of what you want your life to look like, then you can look at the problem. And with that, sometimes it also involves, you know what, sometimes we have to have those conversations that feel painful, that we might not necessarily want to have. But we're having those conversations because our objective for each other is to make sure that I'm happy and that you're happy. That's the most basic principle, is that you enter any of these difficult conversations or these arguments, these disagreements, with the intention of, I want to preserve my well-being and I have the intention of preserving your well-being. And so that might be, yes, I'm willing to have that hard conversation. I'm willing to look at the stuff that we don't want to look at. I'm willing to do all of these things so that I can preserve our greater good. And so when you're in that space, you're really able to be on the same team looking at this problem. Whether it means that you stay together, whether it means you end up parting ways, it doesn't really matter. But the idea is that actually you're in that space together looking at the problem. And the way that you would go about it is really by persistently and continuously trying to understand the other person's perspective, while also understanding that you have your own perspective going on and the other person gets the same as well. And this is really a process of mentalizing. So it's to say, I know what I know, and I know that what I know is not what you know. So I'm going to step out of my head for a moment just so I can stay and sit in your mind. And I'm going to postpone that. And so it's really about me stepping out of myself so I can stand next to you and see your reality from your perspective. And when I've done that, and really go in with the intention of understanding you, not with the intention of just responding, where I might end up just going into defense mode. If I am doing that with the intention of understanding, then I can fully appreciate your perspective. And that's where we really cultivate empathy. And that's when things really start to change, because we're no longer on opposite teams, but we're on the same team. And so then I can invite you over to my perspective. And, one exercise that I tend to do with clients, and I'm going to do it really quick here, just because I think this is a really simple way of seeing this. But let's say over here, I've written the number 3, okay? No trick question. On an objective level, that's the number 3. But it really depends on which direction you're sitting in looking at this, because somebody might be looking at it like this, where it becomes an M, and then your partner might be looking at it like this, where it becomes a W. And so it's not to say that the M is right or that the W is right, but actually they're just both right. It depends on where you're sat, and it depends on where you're looking at it. And so it's really by this intention of always understanding each other, that's when you resolve the conflict in a healthy way. It is truly by understanding and appreciating your partner as a separate entity. What I mean by that is often people get caught up in loving their partner in terms of how they are and who they become within the relationship. We're not talking about that. What we're talking about is you see your partner as a separate entity outside of your relationship. And so one exercise that I would really encourage people to do is, if you imagine your partner on a TV screen, and let's say you don't know this person, right? Let's imagine that we're in this different realm and you're watching your partner on TV screen, and you're seeing what their characteristic is like. You're seeing what their values are like. You're seeing what it is that they enjoy doing, how it is that they talk to other people, how they interact in their relationships, as if you're viewing them from a really objective perspective. And when you're in that state, you can then start recognizing, actually, I really appreciate this person's generosity. I really appreciate this person's intuition. I really appreciate how novice this person is, how adventurous they are, how instinctual they are, how spontaneous they are, whatever it is. But you start recognizing their values and their characteristics and what it is that you appreciate about them as a separate being, nothing to do with you. And in that moment, it becomes a lot easier when you're in the relationship to appreciate that they will want to do certain things that is growth for them, that is not attached to you. Because actually, if you're loving them without any condition, that's part of it. Part of it is being able to see them grow and flourish as they are as a human being. But also there's this connection that comes back to you and back to the relationship. And so a metaphor that I'd like to share is, if you imagine that you're walking down a path. You might be walking down a forest path with your partner, and your partner's right next to you. And every once in a while, you might notice something that you really like, and you might think, oh, wow, you know what? That's a really beautiful tree over there. I'm actually going to just go on a bit of a detour and have a look at that tree. And you might invite your partner along. You might say, hey, do you want to come have a look at this tree? And your partner says, no, it's all right. I'll just wait here for you. Well, that's okay. You go off, you look at the tree, take some pictures, and you come back. And then you're walking together again. And your partner might say, oh, wow, look at that cliff edge. That cliff edge is amazing. I'm going to go over here and explore. Your partner says, hey, do you want to come with? And you might not like cliffs, you might not like heights, and you say, no, thanks, I'm going to stay here. And that's okay, but your partner goes off, they look, they explore, and at some point they come back to you. And it's always this exploration, but then this coming of together. And the togetherness is really the fact that you're both a safe base for each other, that you both have security and reliability and consistency in each other. And actually, it's that enables you to feel safe enough to leave, to explore on your own, to grow on your own, and come back. And then when you're coming back, you can kind of share, oh my goodness, can you believe over this cliff edge I saw this and this and this? And that's amazing to be able to share with that person's experiences. And then you can say, oh my goodness, when I went over here, I saw this eagle and I did this and this. And so with that, we actually both grow, but then we also both maintain that security and safety with each other.